A woman was mocked by her ex-husband at his wedding, until the unexpected truth surfaced. The envelope was thick, ivory, and shimmered faintly under the kitchen light. Madison almost mistook it for a letter from a law firm, but when she saw the gold-stamped initials and recognized the elegant script, her stomach turned. It was a wedding invitation, from her ex-husband, Brian. She hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years, not since the day he tossed their marriage aside like a business deal that no longer profited him. He had moved on, clearly, while she was still gathering the shards of her life in silence. The invitation wasn't just an announcement. It was a statement, one that came with the subtle cruelty only someone who once knew you deeply could deliver. Madison stared at the RSVP card, her hands trembling slightly. Attending would mean stepping into a room filled with people who once called her family, friends, or worse, witnesses to her downfall. She knew it was meant to humiliate her one final time, to place her among the crowd while he paraded his new life, his new wife. Part of her wanted to throw it in the trash. But another part, the one that hadn't yet spoken since the divorce, sat up quietly and said, "Go." Not to retaliate, not to make a scene. Just to look him in the eye, once more, and show that she still existed. Madison had nothing suitable to wear to a high-profile wedding, not after selling most of her designer clothes during her financial collapse. With quiet determination, she spent 3 days altering a navy blue dress she found at a thrift store. She patched the lining, took in the seams, added a vintage brooch that belonged to her grandmother. It wasn't glamorous, but it held dignity, and she clung to that more than any brand name. On the day of the wedding, she pinned her hair back, applied the makeup she had rationed for months, and took the subway to the upscale cathedral in the Northern District. She arrived 20 minutes early, not to be noticed, but to prepare herself. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floors, each step echoing the weight of memories. She hadn't seen Brian since the divorce hearing. That day, he hadn't even looked her in the eye. Today, as she approached the ornate entrance, a valet eyed her with thinly veiled judgment. "Are you here for deliveries?" he asked. She met his gaze evenly and replied, "No. I'm on the guest list." His face flushed as he checked the names. She walked past him with silent grace, her heart pounding, unsure whether she was more anxious about seeing Brian or about pretending she felt nothing when she did. The cathedral was a spectacle of wealth. Crystal chandeliers sparkled under soft candlelight, and the air smelled of imported orchids and expensive perfume. Gold-trimmed programs sat on every seat, detailing the names of the couple, the family lineage, and a list of the high-profile guests. Madison took a seat near the back, careful not to draw attention. From where she sat, she could see the hand-painted frescoes, the string quartet in position, and the gathering crowd of socialites, most of whom hadn't acknowledged her presence. Some whispered. Some pointed. She sat up straighter. Then Brian walked in, accompanied by groomsmen wearing suits that cost more than Madison's monthly rent. He looked older, but confident, wearing the smugness of a man who believed the world had bent to his favor. When his eyes scanned the room and met hers briefly, he hesitated, but only for a second. Then he smiled. Not warmly. Not with regret. But with the calculated precision of someone who had expected her to show up, and had planned exactly how he would deal with it. That smile stung more than any insult. It was a smile of victory. The ceremony proceeded like a scene from a romantic film, meticulously staged and emotionally sterile. The bride, a woman named Celeste, floated down the aisle in a custom gown dripping with crystals. She was tall, blonde, and wore the kind of beauty that commanded a room. Madison watched in silence as Brian took her hand and repeated vows that once belonged to her. The same promises, the same rehearsed warmth, but spoken now with a different partner. Each word was a reminder of what he had discarded. And each glance from the wedding party toward Madison reminded her that she no longer belonged in that circle. At the reception, held at a rooftop garden overlooking the city, the air buzzed with laughter, glasses clinking, and shallow conversation. Madison lingered near the edges, sipping water and politely declining hors d'oeuvres. She had expected to feel pain. What she hadn't expected was the performance Brian would put on. "So good of you to come, Maddie," he said, appearing suddenly at her side. "I told Celeste you'd show up, never could resist a stage, right?" His tone was casual, mocking. She smiled faintly and replied, "I suppose some of us don't need an audience to feel relevant." He chuckled, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. That moment, it wasn't a win for her, but it wasn't a loss either. And that alone gave her a strange sense of calm. As the evening wore on, Madison became the subject of quiet whispers and not-so-subtle glances. She overheard a bridesmaid say, "Isn't that the ex-wife? I heard she went bankrupt." Another murmured, "She looks, well, not bad, considering." Each comment sliced into her, but she kept her chin lifted. The cruelty wasn't new. It had started long before the divorce, when Brian's career began to outshine hers, when he subtly made her feel small at dinner parties, when her ideas were credited to him in public. The humiliation had simply become more overt now, socially sanctioned by the glittering facade of a wedding. The final blow came during Brian's toast. Glass in hand, with his arm around Celeste, he said, "To finding someone who truly fits your life. Sometimes, you have to lose what never worked to discover what you actually deserve." A murmur of polite laughter followed, but several eyes turned toward Madison. She didn't flinch. She didn't leave. She simply set down her drink, walked quietly toward the exit, and slipped away under the soft shimmer of fairy lights. No one stopped her. No one noticed. And that, perhaps, was the most painful truth of all, that the woman he had once called the love of his life could disappear, and the world around him would keep on toasting. Outside the venue, the city air felt different, cooler, cleaner, unfiltered by wealth or pretense. Madison stood on the sidewalk, watching luxury cars pull up and carry off guests who didn't know her name anymore. The sting of the toast echoed in her mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. She had known Brian was capable of cruelty, but never had she expected to be used as a punchline in front of hundreds. It wasn't just betrayal. It was annihilation, dressed in a tuxedo and wrapped in champagne. She sat on a bench nearby, careful not to let the tears reach her makeup. Her pride was all she had left. One woman exited the venue, noticed her sitting there, and paused. "You handled that well," she said quietly. "Better than I would've." Madison nodded, surprised by the kindness. But the woman disappeared into the night before she could reply. For the first time in a long time, Madison didn't feel angry or broken. She felt exhausted, but clear. Something had shifted. And for once, it wasn't Brian pulling the strings. Back inside, Brian was laughing with a group of investors. Madison wasn't there to hear it, but the words traveled anyway. "She was always beneath me," he said with a careless grin. "Smart enough to know how to support me, but never enough to shine on her own." The group laughed, raising glasses. It wasn't cruelty to them. It was performance. In their world, value was measured in wealth, connections, and headlines. Madison was now a cautionary tale of a woman who didn't keep up. But what Brian failed to understand was that the most dangerous people are the ones who endure in silence. Humiliation doesn't erase potential, it refines it. While he played king for the night, the woman he mocked walked deeper into the shadows, where pain didn't echo, it focused. That night, Madison didn't sleep. Instead, she gathered every memory he had tried to rewrite and tucked it somewhere safe. Not to dwell, but to remember. One day, she would need them again, not as wounds, but as weapons. In the days that followed, the silence from people she once called friends was deafening. Her phone didn't ring. No one asked how she was. Those who had once shared dinners, photos, vacations, all of them vanished. Madison had long suspected their loyalty was conditional, but now it was confirmed. She wasn't just alone. She had been erased. People didn't want to be near failure. It stained too easily. She thought of reaching out to Amelia, her old college roommate who had stood beside her at her wedding. But when she sent a simple message, "Hope you're well," she received only a thumbs-up emoji in return. That was all. Madison stared at her screen, laughed bitterly, and deleted the contact. There was no room left in her life for people who disappeared when she needed them most. If this was what falling looked like, then she would fall without pretense and rebuild without apology. Madison packed the few things she had left in her tiny studio apartment. Her lease was ending, and she couldn't afford to renew it. The wedding had been her last social obligation, a moment of closure, even if painful. Now, there were no more expectations to uphold. No more names to keep up with. Just herself. She sold her remaining furniture, leaving behind only a battered bookshelf and a folding chair she used as a nightstand. Every item she let go of was one less reminder of a life that had already ended. Her last night in the apartment was quiet. She didn't cry. She didn't even listen to music. She just sat by the window and watched the city hum without her. For years, she had built her life around Brian's success, curated his world, defended his choices, erased parts of herself to fit into his plans. Now, all of that was gone, and all she had was a suitcase and a fractured resume. But somehow, in the silence, she didn't feel hopeless. She felt free. No one expected anything from her now, and that meant she could become anyone. It had started unraveling long before the divorce, though she hadn't seen it then. Brian had grown colder with success, more distant with each promotion. The man who once brought her flowers on Wednesdays had begun correcting her opinions in public, brushing off her ideas with patronizing smiles. The final straw came the day she was laid off from her own job. Brian had been more concerned with how it would look on his reputation than how she was coping. "Just take a break," he had said. "Maybe this is a sign you weren't meant for that kind of pressure." That night, she had cried in the shower with the water running cold to muffle the sound. She hadn't told anyone, not her parents, not her best friend. She had simply started fading. That was the thing about emotional ruin, it doesn't arrive like a storm. It comes like dust, one layer at a time, until one day, the mirror no longer shows the person you remember. Madison had lived that silence. And now, she was walking away from it. One slow, steady step at a time. 6 months before the wedding, Madison was already losing ground. After the layoff, she struggled to find work. Her background in brand consulting became irrelevant in a market obsessed with youth and tech. Interviewers nodded politely, praised her experience, and never called back. Her savings, once modest but stable, dwindled fast. Rent, utilities, groceries. Life kept charging full price, even after it had stripped her of everything else. She started cutting corners. First the gym membership, then streaming services. Then the luxury skincare she once swore by became drugstore lotion. She pawned her engagement ring after staring at it in a drawer for weeks. Brian never asked for it back, and she never offered. That small act of rebellion paid her rent one final month. But when her credit cards maxed out and unemployment checks stopped coming, she knew she had reached the cliff's edge. It was in year 6 of their marriage when Brian stopped pretending. He no longer attended her birthday dinners. He traveled more, texted less. The man she had loved, the one who once quoted poetry and kissed her forehead in passing, became a stranger who sighed when she entered the room. She knew he was seeing someone else long before he admitted it. It wasn't just intuition. It was the way he answered calls in the hallway. The unexplained weekends. The unfamiliar perfume on his collars. When he finally confessed, it was during brunch on a Sunday. "We've grown apart," he said, slicing into his omelette. "You've changed, Maddie." The words were cruel, not for what they said, but for how casual they sounded. Like he was discussing a stock portfolio. Like her heartbreak was just poor timing. She didn't cry then. She didn't speak at all. She simply nodded, picked up her purse, and left the table. That's when the real silence began. Divorce court was mechanical. Paperwork, signatures, formal words. Brian's lawyer, sharp and smiling, negotiated terms like she was an inconvenience, not a human being. Madison didn't fight back. She didn't have the energy. She let go of the condo, the car, even the joint savings he had quietly drained over months. "You'll land on your feet," he said, as if her entire identity hadn't been dismantled in silence. He didn't even walk her to the elevator. Once the settlement was finalized, her name vanished from contracts, insurance, bank accounts. It was like she'd never existed in his world. And for a while, that's how she lived, unseen, unheard, unneeded. She rented a room in a crumbling duplex on the edge of town, surrounded by peeling paint and neighbors who didn't speak English. But for the first time, she didn't have to tiptoe around someone else's expectations. She could cry without shame, sleep without pretending, and start learning how to breathe again. One week after leaving her apartment, Madison was sleeping in her car. She parked near a library during the day, a church at night. Her belongings fit in the trunk. She brushed her teeth in gas stations and showered at a community center when she could. It wasn't safety. It wasn't comfort. But it was still survival. And that, in itself, became a strange form of power. No one owned her time anymore. No one asked for her silence. One morning, while warming her hands with a takeout coffee she couldn't afford, she passed a corkboard pinned with job postings. Among babysitting gigs and house cleaning ads, one in faded ink read, "Help wanted, corner cafe. No experience needed. Must show up on time." It was a small notice, almost hidden beneath brighter flyers. But something about it felt grounded. She tore the bottom tab off and placed it in her wallet. That night, she didn't cry. She had a reason to wake up early. The corner cafe wasn't glamorous. It had chipped tiles, flickering lights, and smelled like burnt toast and old coffee. But the manager, a woman in her 60s named June, looked Madison up and down with the kind of gaze that saw more than clothes. "You ever worked food service?" she asked. Madison shook her head. "No. But I learn fast." June nodded once. "Be here tomorrow. 6 sharp. Black shirt. No heels." That job saved Madison's life, not with money, but with rhythm. She swept floors, wiped counters, memorized the regulars' orders. She wasn't called ma'am anymore. Just sweetheart or hey, you. At first, she resented the simplicity. But gradually, it began to heal something deeper. For the first time in years, her value wasn't tied to her image, her relationship, or her past. It was in the way she refilled a mug without being asked. In the way she kept showing up. He came in every Thursday at exactly 8:15. Always sat at the corner booth, always ordered black coffee and rye toast. He didn't say much, just read the paper and tipped generously. Madison had noticed him before but never exchanged more than a polite nod. One rainy morning, the booth he always used was taken, and as she passed him waiting by the door, she said, "You're early today." He smiled. "Or maybe I'm just ready for a different view." She offered him a seat at the counter and poured his coffee before he asked. "Name's Colin," he said. "I don't think I've seen you around before a few months ago." She replied, "I wasn't around before a few months ago." Something about his presence felt calm, like the eye of a storm. They didn't talk long, just brief, surface things, but when he left, she found a napkin folded beneath his tip. Written in clean, simple script, people underestimate the power of showing up. Keep doing it. Working at the cafe didn't pay much, but it gave her structure. She learned to predict the rhythms of the neighborhood, the early risers, the late drifters, the lunch rush. Each customer came with their own silent story. June, the manager, noticed her diligence and slowly began trusting her with more responsibility. First the register, then supplier calls, eventually the weekly inventory. There was something humbling about cleaning dishes and counting receipts after years of boardroom meetings and marketing pitches. But it was also grounding. For the first time in years, Madison felt herself rooting into something real. She wasn't being watched or evaluated for her beauty, her relationship, or her social standing. She was judged by whether she showed up, stayed honest, and gave her best. And that was enough, for now. June walked in one afternoon to find Madison reorganizing the front counter display. She had redone the menu signs, optimized item placement, and added color-coded labels to the pastry section. "You do all this?" June asked, raising an eyebrow. Madison nodded. "Old habit. I used to work in branding." June grunted. "Maybe you should have told me that before I paid some guy $300 to make it worse last month." That was the first time someone asked Madison for input like it mattered. June began asking for her thoughts on flyers, promotions, even logo colors. It wasn't a promotion, but it was trust, and Madison treated it like gold. Slowly, her ideas began changing the look and feel of the cafe. New customers started coming in. Old ones noticed the difference. Madison had no office, no title, but she was building something again, even if no one else saw it yet. One late afternoon, Colin stayed behind after the cafe closed. He was finishing paperwork for a local real estate firm and asked if Madison would mind some background noise. "You ever think about going back into business?" he asked, sipping his second cup of decaf. She paused. "That part of my life is over." He nodded. "Well, if you ever change your mind, I know someone looking for help running a project. Nothing flashy. Just honest work, good vision." She smiled politely but tucked his words into the back of her mind. That night, lying on a worn-out mattress in her rented room, she unfolded the napkin he'd written on months earlier. People underestimate the power of showing up. Those words weren't just encouragement, they were a roadmap. She had nothing to lose. So the next morning, after her shift, she asked Colin, "Who's this person looking for help?" He smiled. "Me." Colin ran a set of small community businesses, cafes, bookstores, event spaces. He believed in rebuilding neighborhoods from the inside out. When Madison visited the office he co-managed, she was stunned by the simplicity. No glass towers or marketing jargon. Just purpose, quiet leadership, and people who wanted to make things better. He offered her a role overseeing brand development across his spaces. Modest pay, big responsibility. The offer felt surreal. For the first time since the divorce, someone saw not just her potential, but her present. Still, fear gripped her. What if she failed again? What if people whispered like they did at the wedding? She took a walk through a nearby park, hands in her pockets, wind brushing her cheeks. The woman who had once been discarded, mocked, and forgotten was no longer the same. And neither was her answer. "Yes," she told Colin. "I'm in." Colin didn't hand her power, he gave her space to earn it. Madison started with branding layouts, social media drafts, and in-store promotions. But what made her invaluable wasn't just her eye for detail. It was how she connected with people. Staff began coming to her before going to anyone else. Customers noticed. Revenues ticked upward. Within months, Colin quietly moved her into a managerial role, no ceremony, just a new nameplate and a set of keys. "You sure about this?" she asked. "You're already doing the job," he replied. That night, Madison stared at her name on the office door. It wasn't the company she once dreamed of running. But it was real. And this time, she built it herself, from the foundation up. Colin invited her to a charity gala he was sponsoring, something about local housing programs and educational grants. Madison hesitated. She hadn't worn a dress that wasn't for work in years. But with encouragement from June and a borrowed gown from a coworker, she walked into the hotel ballroom and turned more heads than she expected. Not for beauty, but for presence. The room was full of familiar energy, polished voices, curated laughter, expensive shoes. But Madison didn't feel small anymore. She moved through the crowd with calm precision, greeting people, discussing strategy, offering ideas. One woman leaned over and whispered, "Who is she?" Colin only smiled and said, "Someone who changed everything when no one was watching." Near the end of the evening, Madison was scanning the silent auction tables when she heard a voice behind her. "Maddie?" It wasn't her name that made her freeze, it was the tone. Half curious, half nervous. She turned around slowly, and there stood Brian, tuxedoed, holding a drink, expression flickering between surprise and confusion. "You look different," he said. She smiled, just enough to be polite. "It's been a while." He chuckled, clearly uncomfortable. "Didn't expect to see you here." Madison glanced around casually. "I manage half the branding for this venue now. Why wouldn't I be here?" The silence that followed was thick. Brian didn't know whether to smile or apologize. In truth, he wasn't prepared to see her standing tall in a place he assumed she'd never belong again. Brian fumbled through conversation, awkwardly trying to explain how he never meant for things to turn out the way they did. Madison listened, but didn't react. "You once said I was beneath you," she finally said, voice low. "At your wedding." He blushed, coughed. "You remember that?" She stepped closer, her voice still calm. "That was the last thing I needed to hear before everything broke. And maybe, the first thing that made me rebuild." Their conversation drew quiet attention. People glanced over, sensing history. Colin approached from the side, placing a hand gently on Madison's shoulder. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Perfect," she said, without breaking eye contact with Brian. That one word, spoken with poise, cut deeper than anything else. Brian offered a weak nod, then stepped back. For the first time, he looked small. As the gala ended, guests filtered out with champagne buzz and glossy smiles. Madison stayed behind to help the staff clean up, something she did without hesitation. When she passed by the coat check, a server handed her a note left behind. It was from Brian. "You've changed," it read. "I misjudged you. No phone number. No apology. Just guilt folded neatly into paper." She didn't need to respond. The victory wasn't in confrontation, it was in evolution. She walked out into the cold night, coat tight around her, heels clicking softly. For years, she had lived with the noise of judgment, of failure, of shame. Now, she moved in silence, but with impact. And the world had finally begun to hear her again, not for who she had been, but for who she chose to become. A week after the gala, Madison received an unexpected email from a corporate investor interested in expanding Colin's model into other cities. They had been watching her branding work from afar, and now they wanted to meet. Colin read the message and smiled. "Looks like the world's finally catching up," he said. Madison sat with the offer for a while. This time, success didn't scare her. She wasn't proving anything to anyone anymore. The meeting was held in a downtown office with glass walls and sleek suits. But Madison didn't shrink. She laid out projections, values, and insisted on keeping the community model intact. At the end, the lead investor leaned back and said, "We're not just funding your expansion. We want your leadership." Colin stepped aside gracefully. Madison was now co-owner and director. No titles needed approval. She'd earned every inch of it. Word traveled fast. A local business magazine did a feature titled "From Rock Bottom to Boardroom," with Madison's photo gracing the front cover. It was tasteful, dignified, and honest. The story didn't hide her past, it used it to highlight her resilience. When the article circulated in her old social circles, messages poured in. People she hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered her name. One evening, she was invited to a networking dinner hosted by one of her former acquaintances, someone who had once turned their back on her. Out of curiosity, she went. The moment she entered, conversations slowed. Several stood, awkward smiles on their faces. "Madison?" someone stammered. She nodded and took a seat. She wasn't there for revenge. She was simply reclaiming the space they once denied her. Brian was there too. Of course he was. Still charming, still dressed to impress. But something had shifted in his posture, his arrogance dulled. When he approached her, he spoke softly. "I read your interview. You've done well." Madison met his gaze. "I didn't do well," she said. "I rebuilt. There's a difference." He looked like he wanted to respond, but no words came. She didn't need an apology. He wasn't part of her story anymore, just a shadow from the past. "You thought I was still broken," she continued. "But the woman you knew? She doesn't live here anymore." Brian gave a slow, silent nod. And for the first time, she saw it, regret, not because he missed her, but because he had never seen her clearly to begin with. That night, walking home beneath the glow of streetlights, Madison felt no need to rehash old wounds. Closure wasn't something Brian or anyone else could give her, it was something she had earned through every sleepless night, every dish scrubbed, every quiet decision to keep going. She had nothing to prove. Nothing to avenge. She passed the cafe where it all began and saw June wiping down the counters. She stepped inside, rolled up her sleeves, and helped without saying a word. June looked at her and grinned. "Still can't stay away, huh?" Madison just laughed. The cafe, the people, the journey, they weren't her escape. They were her anchor. And in that stillness, she found peace that power alone could never offer. Years later, at the launch of her fourth location, Madison stood before a room of young entrepreneurs, many of whom came from struggle. She told her story, not the glamorous version, but the real one. The silence. The shame. The rebuild. She didn't speak with bitterness. She spoke with grace. And when she finished, a young woman raised her hand and asked, "What made you keep going?" Madison paused, then answered, "Because no one believed I would. And I decided to become the kind of woman I could respect, even if no one else ever noticed." The room erupted in quiet applause. Not for the success, but for the truth. Madison had walked through fire and come out not unburned, but transformed. Her story wasn't just about rising again, it was about learning that the real victory was never in being accepted. It was in finally accepting herself.